Caith me the Fulcher, everyone, and happy St. Patrick's Day to my fellow countrymen and to everybody. It's always a special day for Irish people. When I was a boy, it was the day in Lent that didn't count. So if you gave up biscuits and sweets and all that for Lent, you could, St. Patrick's Day, you just gorged yourself on them. You completely lost the point. But yes, that's what it is. And I was reminded this morning of a wonderful story about when I was a student. There is a little town in Gloucestershire that on this week every year becomes the 27th county of Ireland. I speak, of course, of Cheltenham. And because half of Ireland goes there normally. There's a lovely occasion where Father Dennis Higgins, one of our priests, and a friend, Dave Kiley, they went to the rector, the boss of our seminary, and asked permission. You had to ask permission if you wanted to do it. They wanted a day off. And the rector used to get embarrassed about all of these things. He was a very wonderful person. And so they said to him, Father, can we have a day off to go to the Cheltenham Festival? And to which the rector said to Dennis, yes, Dennis, well, what sort of music do they have there? And he said, oh, it's not music, Father, it's horses. Oh dear, does that involve gambling? Well, a bit, yes. Anyway, they discussed the matter and they persuaded him to let them go to the Cheltenham Festival for a day because half the priests in Ireland were there and they wanted the opportunity for some pastoral interaction. Now, the pastoral interaction certainly wasn't true, but it was true that half the priests in Ireland were there. So that's my memory of St. Patrick's Day and Cheltenham Festival all those years ago. Anyway, happy St. Patrick's Day to you all. Before last week's celebration of Robin's life, which was deeply moving, we were talking about why have people stopped going to church and will they continue stopping, or why would they go in the first place? And I'll just go through some of the things that I said just to remind you. I said that for some people going to church was just another thing. It's like going to the cinema, and it was detached from a living relationship with Christ. It was just another thing that you did on Sundays, maybe for family reasons, certain birthdays and whatever, an occasional wander into the church. But it was completely detached. It was a detached sort of activity. And in his book, Why Go to Church, Father Timothy Ratcliffe wrote in 2008, going to the Eucharist is not like going to see a film. One can come straight off the street into a cinema and be bowled over by a drama on the screen. One is caught up in the drama, which begins and ends in a couple of hours. But the Eucharist is the drama of one's whole life, birth to death and beyond. It reshapes one's heart and mind as someone whose happiness is to be found in God. If we think of it as entertainment, competing with TV and football for an audience, then of course we have to put on a good show, if there are to be bums on seats. But then there is the danger of the liturgy becoming the priest's show. The priest must put on his or her weekly performance, get his audience rolling in the aisles, not to mention putting money in the collection plate. This imposes a vast strain on the clergy. Will I pull it off this week? But it also misses the point. It gives ownership of the liturgy to the clergy and not to the whole people, he said. And then we spoke of, as I just mentioned, other things that people choose to do, like shopping, sport, dancing, and anything but a church. We talked of work patterns changing, how people are now obliged to work at weekends, particularly in the caring industry and retail industry, and so there's no space for them to come to Mass on a Sunday. Then we talked about the sports options, Sky Sports taking over our weekends and changing forever our schedules, putting on matches at absurd times, including right slap bang in the middle of Good Friday. So these are lots of the things that we spoke about, and there are a few more that I want to consider today. First of all is what we call the culture of me. Many times I've spoken to you about the L'Oreal advert on the television saying those 4 fateful words, because you're worth it. saying to people, reinforcing, you spend all your money on this because you're worth it. Spoil yourself, indulge yourself, you're worth it, you're the only one that matters. And of course, that's a kind of marketing strategy to get people to think of themselves and obviously spend money on themselves. And Father Timothy comments about this. In our sophisticated society, it is entertainment that draws the crowds. Shopping is an entertainment, I'm told. Priests and pastors, like teachers, writers and footballers, must entertain if they are to keep their following. Our age is characterised as one of believing without belonging. Religion is a private affair between my God and me. What happens on Sundays in church is irrelevant, so why go? Many people say, well, I can say my prayers at home and I don't need to go to church. But they're thinking primarily of themselves and their own comfort, rather than taking any positive steps towards our Lord and what he's asking of us. Now that we provide a Sunday Mass here on the television, for those who can't get out, there will be pressure to continue doing this when we're all allowed back as people have become used to the idea of following their faith from their own homes on the TV. And we might argue that the consequence of all this preoccupation with me is often a sense of overstimulation, boredom, and a growing feeling of pointlessness in life. In the end, you do get rather bored with yourself. So why else would people now be longing to get back together in some fashion after these months of isolation? So if we're so caught up in ourselves and that's so important, why are we longing to get back together? There must be something else that makes us want to have an interaction with other people, particularly our families. So we'll look at some of the features then as to why people don't go to church. There's what we call the secularist world. And there is a difference between secular and secularist. Secular is a world that does not have a God but respects people who do. Secularist is a world that doesn't think we should have a God and rejects him and people who espouse their faith in him. We are living in an unashamedly godless society, but we don't need to pretend about that. But that doesn't mean to say, as we were talking about last time, that, because people don't have a God, that they're not nice people or good people, which is completely wrong, because many of them are splendid people, kind and generous, unlike, one might argue, some believers who often are not splendidly kind and generous at all, and in fact sometimes do some dreadful things in the name of their God in different parts of the world. When Pope Benedict came in 2010, he spoke of what he called an aggressive secularism. That is, a determined attempt to wipe away any trends of religion. So, the vestiges of Christianity are fading away. There's a move to rename Christmas as a winter festival, or in Leicester they called it Winterval. There is the prevention of wearing Christian symbols, such as crucifixes or, burqas, and which are for the symbols of the Islamic faith. There's the removal of the oath of allegiance to God from the scouts and uniform bodies, and also the oath made in a courtroom. And it would appear that to believe in this world is often perceived to be a rather foolish preoccupation, something that is not scientifically verifiable and therefore untrue. And to practice a belief is sometimes to incur ridicule from others that many people are not strong enough to resist. Now, in his wonderful encyclical, The Joy of the Gospel, Pope Francis comments, the process of secularization tends to reduce the faith and the church to the sphere of the private and the personal. Furthermore, by completely rejecting the transcendent, it has produced a growing deterioration of ethics, a weakening of the sense of personal and collective sin, and a steady increase in the sense of relativism. These have led to a sense of disorientation, especially in the periods of adolescence and young adulthood, which are so vulnerable to change. We're living in the information-driven society which bombards us indiscriminately with data, all treated as being of equal importance, which leads to a remarkable superficiality in the area of moral discernment. In response, we need to provide an education which teaches critical thinking and encourages development of more mature moral values. So that's the secularist agenda. And then, why would you not go to church? Well, what we perceive to be the church itself as an institution. The Catholic Church in recent times has struggled with being exposed as hypocritical and deceitful, especially in the matter of the abuse of children by its clergy and the covering up of their offences by its bishops. The effect of this behaviour has been devastating. Some people simply cannot face being part of an organisation, some of whose members have done unspeakable things to children, and others try to cover it all up to save face. Nobody is more ashamed of this than me. And I really don't know how we can ever recover from this unless we completely change how we do things in the name of preaching and living the gospel. More than this, there's been a concerted effort and attempt to return to the certainties of the past ages, almost as if the Second Vatican Council had never happened. Right-wing movements and religious congregations have flourished and yet floundered once their hypocrisy was exposed. And even today, a French bishop in the Society of St. Pius V has called the rite of Mass, which has been present for the past 50 years, evil. Retiring into what's called this ghetto mindset of certainty and people doing as they were told by the clergy will not solve our problems. Father Anthony came up with a wonderful expression last weekend which tickled me, but more or less it was true. He talked about cave dwellers, people who live in the ghetto of their own minds. Cave standing for constantly against virtually everything. So if you're a cave dweller, please don't be offended. But the Pope points out, when we as Christians are closed in our group, in our movement, in our parish, in our own environment, we remain closed, and what happens to us is what happens to whatever remains closed. When a room is closed, the odour of humidity gathers, and if a person is closed in that room, they become ill. When a Christian is closed in his group or parish or movement, he remains closed and becomes ill. The heads of the church have often been narcissists, flattered and thrilled by their courtiers. The court is the leprosy of the papacy. The Curia has one defect: it is Vatican-centric. It sees and looks after the interests of the Vatican, which are still, for the most part, temporal interests. This Vatican-centred view neglects the world around us. The Pope says, "I do not share this view, and I'll do everything I can to change it." The Church is, or should go back to being, a community of the people of God. Priests, pastors and bishops who have the care of souls are at the service of the people of God. I believe, to me this is the most urgent problem the Church is facing. I believe in God, not a Catholic God. There is no Catholic God, there is God. And I believe in Jesus Christ, his incarnation. Jesus is my teacher and my pastor, but God, the Father, Abba, the light and the Creator. This is my being. Clericalism should have nothing to do with Christianity. And clericalism is the idea that the bishop or the priest is superior to the rest of people of God because of his ordination and therefore runs the church rather than serving it. And so this ghetto mentality is quite prevalent. There's a wonderful song by Paul Simon many years ago called "I Am a Rock." Hiding in my room, safe within my tomb, I touch no one and no one touches me. I am a rock, I am an island. Cut off in our own little world where nobody else can get in and nobody can get out. And that has been something that Pope Francis has encountered, especially with his own government. And one of the most important tasks that he has been said is to be reforming of his government, the Curia, which is called, which has clearly run away with itself and ostracised so many people to the point that they can no longer be part of a church which is dictatorial and judgmental. The Pope has done this quietly without anyone really noticing because they cannot read what I call the subtext or what he says and does. So, for example, many cardinals resign from their posts in the Vatican at 75, as they're required to do, fully expecting the Pope to refuse their resignation and then being shocked and angered when he actually accepted it. And again, we do need to make a distinction here. We make a distinction between the Pope and the Vatican, which are not the same, rather like the Queen and the palace, as we now call it. People love the Pope and the Queen, but they're not so sure about the Vatican and the palace and people who work for them. The next thing is our unwillingness to make sacrifices. How many people refuse to recognize their responsibilities to each other, even members of their own families? Elderly parents and young children are often neglected or abused in one way or another, and each day we see example of horrific events that take place regularly within families and the treatment they mete out to each other. At the heart of love is service and sacrifice, but this climate militates against it. We do not see or accept that we have a duty to each other as human beings, especially those among us far and away in need. The credit card charitable giving may satisfy our guilt, but it is painless and hardly noticeable. So how many people will support comic relief this Friday from the comfort of their armchairs without asking themselves, why have I got to do this? Why are these people starving? And what can I really do to change that? An unwillingness to put oneself out for another person leads inevitably to a failure to understand the ultimate sacrifice of Jesus Christ and the price paid by so many of his followers since. We simply do not see the need or satisfy ourselves with what we might call will that do mentality. Even to change our Sunday habits to accept the Lord's invitation to do this in memory of me will not be acceptable if it's not convenient. Father Timothy comments, many people went in the past to church because they feared that they would be punished by God if they did not. But this threat is hardly going to fill our churches in the 21st century. Who could believe that ours is a God of love if we have to be compelled by the threat of damnation to go and worship him? Many of you will remember that what we called missing Mass was considered at one time to be a mortal sin, punishable by fire and brimstone, as many clergy were wont to tell us. But it might be worth considering that it's actually virtually impossible to commit a mortal sin under its own terms of reference, namely that it was serious, intentional, and with knowledge. And my RE teacher, who became Father Derek Lance 50 years ago, used to say, sin, serious, intentional, and knowledge. He used to say knowledge, that it was meant to be against God. It was serious and intended. And to actually put those three together is very difficult. Now, in many people's minds, missing Mass is not sinful at all. It's just a case of not being able to fit it in this week because it is just another thing. One might argue that we've now moved to the other end of the spectrum from this punitive extreme to this extreme where nothing matters at all. And Pope Benedict called this moral relativism, namely that you make up your own rules so that you can follow them and never break them. We'll talk about that, I'm sure, on another occasion. There will surely be many other reasons why people have stopped going to church, even though they often want to excuse themselves and take offence if you say that they clearly no longer believe. Somehow to them, being a Christian means being a good person. And of course, you can always be a good person if you set your own standards and live by your own rules. The thought of being inadequate, irresponsible, or just plain wrong will never be allowed to enter our psyche. Just ask any teacher who has to put up with endless complaints from parents who cannot accept that their little darlings are not all they want them to be, having lavished so much attention and money on them. Finally, here's a thing to consider. A new aspect of our life in lockdown has been the emergence of the takeaway food, as the only means that some restaurants can keep going. And so there is a plethora of home delivery adverts on the TV, most of which are presented to us by a rapping gentleman in a series of outrageous outfits called, I believe, Snoop Dogg. According to Mark, who is media savvy, he was once called Snoop Doggy Dog, but now he is just Snoop Dogg. So there is this man sitting astride a silver motorcycle in rather outlandish gear, and then it cuts to him with ladies looking after him and in different things. And his mantra is, "Did anybody say just eat?" Well, actually, somebody did say that, just eat. Somebody said, "Take and eat." Somebody said, "Take and eat, this is my body." Somebody said, "Do this in memory of me." And that's why we do. It is the Lord Jesus who invites us. And on this beautiful day, I want to finish by reminding us, in the words of the great St. Patrick, what that actually means. Christ be with me, Christ within me, Christ behind me, Christ before me, Christ beside me, Christ to win me, Christ to comfort and restore me, Christ beneath me, Christ above me, Christ in quiet, Christ in danger, Christ in the hearts of all that love me, Christ in the mouth of friend and stranger. I bind into myself today the strong name of the Trinity, by invocation of the same, the three in one and one in three, of whom all nature hath creation, eternal Father, Spirit, Lord. Praise to the God of my salvation. Salvation is of Christ the Lord. Amen.